Hello everybody, this is Mr. Sexton and we're getting ready for our daily video for day 6 of the semester, December 24th, 2018. Now, I hope everybody did okay on the exam. As you probably know, there was one question on the exam that I have to manually grade. So if grades are not posted yet, or if it's showing up as you have no grade, the reason for that is that I have not manually graded all of those questions yet. As soon as I get those graded, and hopefully that'll be sometime today, your grades will show up for the exam. Please make sure any questions you have in the way that the exam was administered or any problems you may have had with the quiz or the exam, I'm sorry, go ahead and make sure you call me early this week. One other thing I want to remind you about today's class is that tomorrow is Christmas, so we will not have any assignments due that day. So what will happen is I will actually leave the assignments open today and tomorrow. So while these will show up on the Moodle for today, they actually will not be due until 8 a.m. Wednesday morning. So if you choose to complete these assignments on Christmas Day instead of Christmas Eve, that is your prerogative. Okay, what we're going to talk about today and what you're going to read about today is Chapter 5, dealing with civil rights. Now, a lot of students get confused between civil rights and civil liberties, but obviously they're different because, first of all, your textbook has two separate chapters on it. Okay? But also keep in mind that civil liberties tend to deal more with individual liberties. If you take away my civil liberties, you're taking away my personal right to do something. Generally, when we talk about civil rights, we're talking about something being taken away from me because of some that group that I belong to, and that group that I belong to is not necessarily one that I get choose to belong to. I don't get to choose to be male or female. I don't choose to be African American or white, or I don't get choose usually to be disabled or not disabled. Okay, so civil rights do differ from civil liberties. What we're going to look at when it deals with civil rights in this chapter is we're going to start off with when we see the most significant changes in the civil rights movements. People have been fighting for their civil rights in this country going all the way back to the creation of this country. But what your textbook is going to start talking about mostly is when we started to see significant strides in civil rights battles. And of course, that is right after the Civil War. You're going to read in the textbook about the period right after the Civil War, which we call Reconstruction. And during that time period, we saw some major changes, both positive and negative, for the civil rights movement, primarily for African Americans. In particular, make sure you're familiar with what we call the Reconstruction or Civil War or Civil Rights Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Understand what each of those deal with. Now, you need to also understand when Reconstruction ended, why it ended, specifically a historical event that caused it to end, and make sure you understand what happened when civil Reconstruction ended. We see a huge fallback to way things used to be prior to the Civil War. African Americans were treated very badly, obviously. Then during the period of Reconstruction, they start to be treated a little bit better. And then when we end Reconstruction, we go back to some very negative treatment of African Americans, primarily in the South. Make sure, as we're talking about the period after Reconstruction, make sure you understand what Jim Crow laws are. Have some examples of Jim Crow laws. Then also, one of probably the most seminal or most important cases in our country's history, be familiar with Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson is a court case that deals with the idea of the separate but equal doctrine. Understand what the separate but equal doctrine stated. Now, the separate but equal doctrine becomes the legal precedent, the legal standard for racial treatment in this country up until 1954. Between Plessy versus Ferguson, which happens in 1896, and Brown versus Board of Education, which happens in 1954, we have the creation of the NAACP. Be familiar with what the NAACP is and what their primary goal was when they were first created. Now, when Brown versus Board of Education is decided in 1954, obviously racial discrimination doesn't just end overnight. Be familiar with this concept that we talk about in the textbook known as strict scrutiny. It's a shift in the burden of proof as to whether or not an action is legal discrimination or not. Be familiar with that. Also, as we see changes after Brown versus Board of Education, make sure you understand the difference between de jure and de facto discrimination. And know that de facto discrimination is more than just discrimination based on the facts or by facts. Understand really what de facto discrimination is. Make sure you understand that it is based on personal choices and things of that nature. And then make sure you understand what de jure discrimination is. Now, after Brown versus Board of Education, after this very important Supreme Court decision, we see the legislatures around the country, Congress, and eventually state legislatures start passing civil rights legislation, civil rights laws. Make sure you're familiar with some of the more important civil rights acts, as they call them in your textbook, the Voting Rights Act and the Housing Rights Act and things like that. Be familiar what specifically Congress does around the different areas in which we've seen civil rights discrimination. Things like housing rights, voting rights, educational rights. Make sure you understand the different ways that the Supreme Court and the legislature, Congress in particular, have addressed those areas. Then one of the last areas of the chapter that you need to really focus your attention on today is civil rights battles by particular groups within our society. African Americans aren't the only ones that have ever fought for their civil rights. There are a number of groups that have fought for their civil rights. Some of the significant ones that are discussed in the chapter are women, gender rights. We have racial groups, obviously, African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans. All of these different racial groups have at one time or another in our history had to fight for their civil rights. Now, also, make sure you're aware of the fact that individuals that are disabled, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is a piece of civil rights legislation that dealt with the civil rights of disabled individuals. Be familiar with that act. And then, of course, the civil rights battle that lots of people say is raging today in the country are the rights of the LGBT community. There's lots of discussion going on in our country right now about what civil rights should people have around sexual orientation. And there's also even a debate as to whether or not, there is a civil rights issue when we look at sexual orientation. So be familiar with that section in the textbook. And then the final thing that I want you to be able to glean out of the textbook is the concept or the idea of what affirmative action is. Please, as you're reading the chapter, make sure you understand that affirmative action is not quota systems. Lots of people think that affirmative action is about making sure you have a quota of a certain percentage of African Americans, a certain percentage of whites, and a certain percentage of Asians, or whatever it happens to be. Understand truly what affirmative action is. Understand that the concept is made up of two words: affirmative, which means positive, and actions are steps that you take. So affirmative action deals with positive steps to make up for past discrimination. And understand again, affirmative action is not a quota system. So good luck with the chapter, and I hope you have a merry and blessed Christmas.